Welcome to a story that changed the world forever. Today we're diving deep into the events of September 11th, a day of tragedy, mystery, and lasting impact. Stick with me as we uncover truths, question narratives, and explore how that day reshaped America and the world. Trust me, you won't want to miss a second of this. Scene 1. The Woman in the Window. It began as an ordinary morning, the kind you forget by lunchtime, the kind that doesn't ask to be remembered. Maria Fernandez had made the same walk from her apartment to the South Tower for 6 years, 47 minutes door to desk. The clack of her heels on the pavement matched the beat of a city that never stopped moving. Manhattan was its usual September self. Crisp air, sleepy cab drivers, and the gentle golden warmth of a late summer sun hanging over the skyline. She took the elevator up to the 78th floor, sipping her coffee like she always did, one hand holding a worn leather notebook, the other scrolling through her phone. Her desk faced the windows, floor-to-ceiling panes that offered the illusion of floating above the clouds. She liked to pause there, just for a few seconds, to breathe, to feel tall in a city that constantly tried to shrink people. At 8:46 a.m., the building shook. Not like in the movies, not like a rumble or an explosion, more like a structure exhaled violently. An enormous cough from the earth itself. The floor beneath her shifted. The lights flickered, papers lifted from desks like birds startled from rest. There was silence. Then came the fire. She couldn't comprehend what had happened. No one could. A blinding light poured through the windows. The air grew thick, acrid, wrong. Screams echoed from behind cubicle walls, footsteps pounding towards stairwells. Phones began to ring, and then stopped ringing altogether. Some people moved, some froze, some prayed. Maria stood by the window, staring north. Smoke, dark, greasy smoke curled from the North Tower. She couldn't process it. A plane, an actual plane, had struck the building across from her. The wing had torn through steel and glass like paper. She saw it. She saw people, tiny figures in distant windows, waving, screaming, jumping. She wanted to run, but her legs refused to understand. Down the stairwell, down 78 floors. Some were barefoot, some carried others. A man clutched a rosary, whispering over and over in Spanish. Someone else vomited. No one knew if they were evacuating or escaping, but they moved, packed shoulder to shoulder, silent and sobbing. Maria made it to the ground floor. Outside, chaos had taken the shape of dust and disbelief. Sirens howled in every direction. People stared upward with mouths open and hands over their hearts or over their eyes. The towers loomed above them, one now scarred, the other still whole. Until it wasn't. At 9:03 a.m., the second plane struck. Maria watched it happen. Watched the impact erupt into flames. Watched bodies and debris fall like meteorites from the sky. She collapsed to her knees, not from injury, but from the sheer magnitude of the moment. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't random. It was war, and it had come from the clouds. She would never forget the silence that followed the second impact. Not the screaming, not the sirens, but the moment of realization that nothing would ever be the same, that they were witnessing history as it bled into the streets. In that moment, Maria wasn't thinking about work or rent or her to-do list. She was thinking about her mother in the Bronx, about the last text she sent, about whether she would ever laugh again without guilt, about how the sky, so beautiful and blue just minutes ago, now looked like the end of the world. The city she loved was burning, and no one, Not Maria, not the firefighters charging into the smoke, not the world watching from their TVs. Understood just how much had changed in that single, cruel hour. Scene 2. The Man Who Ran. Tommy O'Reilly was already halfway through his shift when the first call came in. He had been with Ladder 11 for 12 years, a career firefighter, Irish Catholic, grew up in Queens, the kind of guy who could quote Sinatra, fix a water heater, and break down a locked door in under 10 seconds. When the tone dropped over the intercom at 8:49 a.m., he didn't ask questions. He just moved. Dispatch wasn't even sure what had happened. Possible explosion at the World Trade Center, they said. That's all. No one knew it was a plane. Not yet. He climbed into the rig with 5 others. They were silent, checking gear, adjusting straps. Tommy looked out the window as they turned onto FDR Drive. He could already see the smoke, thick and rising, far too dark for a simple office fire. Something's wrong, he muttered. When they arrived, the streets were chaos. Civilians flooded out of subway stations covered in dust. Reporters were already filming. Police were shouting into radios, pointing to the sky. And then he looked up. The North Tower burned like a wounded animal. Fire rolled out from dozens of windows. Paper and glass floated through the air like confetti at the world's worst parade. From that distance, he couldn't see the hole where the plane had hit, but he could see what came after. Bodies falling, people jumping. He would never forget that part. The chief gave quick orders. Ladder 11 was assigned stairwells. Tommy adjusted his oxygen tank, pulled the mask over his face, and entered the lobby. It looked like a war zone. The marble floors were cracked and soaked. Ceiling tiles hung like broken teeth. Water ran down the walls from burst pipes. Still, he ran in. He started climbing, 20 pounds of gear on his back, hose in hand, surrounded by smoke. The radio crackled with confusion. People were trapped on upper floors. The elevators were dead. The heat grew unbearable after the 40th floor. He passed a woman helping a man with a broken leg. He passed another firefighter coming down, coughing blood. Every few floors, he stopped to check doors, call out, bang on walls. And then the tower shook, not from below, but from the side. It was 9:03 a.m., the second plane. He didn't see it, but he felt it, a massive jolt. Lights went out. Debris rained from the ceiling. The building groaned like something alive and angry. And then the radio went dead. He kept climbing. Why? He didn't know. Habit, duty, faith. Around the 65th floor, he found a group of office workers huddled in a hallway. One woman had collapsed from smoke inhalation. He and a fellow firefighter lifted her, step by step, breath by breath. They made it down to the 30th floor before the South Tower collapsed. It sounded like thunder, like 1,000 freight trains slamming into each other. The stairwell trembled. Dust poured in. Lights died. They didn't know which tower had fallen. They didn't know if they were next. They kept moving. Tommy would later say he wasn't thinking. He wasn't brave. He was just doing what he was trained to do. But that's not how the survivors remembered it. They remembered the calm in his voice, the way he said, "You're gonna be okay," like it was a promise. The way he stayed behind to carry the unconscious. He got 12 people out of the building that day. Minutes later, the North Tower fell. Tommy didn't make it out. His body was never found. But they say his helmet was recovered a block away, buried in rubble, still intact. His wife received it 3 weeks later, wrapped in the American flag. She keeps it on a shelf, next to a photo of him in uniform. Their son, now 17, Says he still hears his father's voice when he runs drills at the academy. He never met him. But every step he takes toward a burning building, he takes for him. Scene 3. The sound that shouldn't be major. David Keller had heard all kinds of sounds in his 21 years of service. Missile tests in the Mojave Desert, jet engines screaming across the Persian Gulf, helicopter rotors slicing through jungle air in Colombia. But what he heard on the morning of September 11th, 2001, inside the Pentagon, was something else, something unnatural, something wrong. At precisely 9:37 a.m., while standing in a corridor just outside Corridor 5 on the first floor of the Pentagon's western side, David heard what he would later describe as the sound of air tearing. Not an explosion, not a crash, a tear, and then the world folded in. A wave of fire and steel and glass. The walls around him caved in, the ceiling cracked, and heat, unbearable heat, surged through the hallway. People screamed, not just from pain, but from confusion. The kind of scream a soldier lets out when the battlefield follows him home. Before he even knew what had happened, David was crawling on his elbows through debris and darkness, blood dripping from a gash on his forehead. The air reeked of burning plastic, aviation fuel, and something else, something like scorched skin. People stumbled through smoke, calling out names, ranks, anything that would make this feel less surreal. Someone shouted, "A plane! A plane hit us!" David froze. New York had just been hit. Everyone in the Pentagon knew that. Televisions were blaring with the images of the North and South Towers burning. It was the only thing people were talking about that morning, but no one imagined it would spread here, to the heart of the U.S. military. Yet, here they were, and a third plane had just punched a hole through the most secure building in the country. The west side, where renovations were nearly complete, was now rubble. Fires licked along steel beams. The sprinkler system had activated, but it only added steam to the smoke, blinding everyone. David stumbled into an open office where several others were trapped under a collapsed beam. Without thinking, he grabbed a metal chair and used it as a lever. For 10 full minutes, he worked the beam back and forth until it finally shifted. They were free, but others weren't. A woman, her face covered in soot, asked him, "Is this war?" David didn't answer. He didn't know. But deep down, he felt it. This wasn't just terror, it was strategy. Across the Pentagon, phones rang, lines were jammed. The Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, was seen helping carry stretchers, an act later debated and politicized, but real nonetheless. There was no script for what to do when your own fortress was breached. Within minutes, military personnel began to secure the perimeter. Evacuation protocols were activated. Helicopters buzzed overhead. Sirens from Arlington and D.C. screamed through the air. Smoke rose from the gash in the building's west side, like a signal to the world. America had been struck again, and it wasn't over. David eventually emerged into the daylight, his uniform torn, eyes squinting through soot. Emergency workers ran past him, yelling for clearance. Medics began setting up triage tents. News cameras miles away caught the first images of the blackened Pentagon. In that moment, David understood the depth of what had occurred. Not just buildings brought down or people killed, but an entire sense of invulnerability shattered. Later, after helping move wounded colleagues, he stood beside a colonel, watching the smoke rise into the clear September sky. "They're not done," the colonel said. And he was right. Flight 93 was still in the air. Scene 4. The quiet before the roar. Todd Beamer had no idea that morning would be his last. He kissed his wife goodbye at 6:15 a.m., left a note for his sons, and drove to Newark International Airport. His flight, United Airlines Flight 93, was scheduled to depart at 8 a.m. to San Francisco. He was headed west for a business meeting, just another day. The boarding was smooth. The plane wasn't even full. Only 33 passengers. He found his seat near the back, stretched his legs, and pulled out a Sky Mall magazine. Nothing felt wrong, not yet. The plane was delayed, stuck on the tarmac. Todd texted his wife, "Running a bit late." That message would be the last she'd ever get from him. At 8:42 a.m., Flight 93 finally took off. 26 minutes later, Flight 11 struck the North Tower. At 9:03 a.m., Flight 175 hit the South Tower. And still, aboard Flight 93, there was no panic. At 9:25 a.m., the FAA warned air traffic controllers, "Beware cockpit intrusion." Moments later, Flight 93 turned sharply off course, headed southeast toward Washington, D.C. By 9:28, the hijacking had begun. Voices were raised, screams echoed through the cabin. Two men stormed the cockpit, wrestled the pilots down, and took control. They shouted in Arabic. One had a bomb strapped to his chest, or at least something that looked like one. Passengers were herded to the back. Some cried, some prayed. Some simply sat still, paralyzed. But a few began to act. Todd Beamer, Mark Bingham, Tom Burnett, Jeremy Glick. 4 men among dozens who realized what was happening and decided to fight back. What changed everything were the phone calls. From seatback phones, passengers called loved ones. And through broken, static-filled connections, they learned the truth. The towers were gone. The Pentagon was burning. This wasn't a hijacking for ransom. This was a suicide mission. Todd dialed an airphone operator named Lisa Jefferson. Calmly, he told her what was happening, that they were planning to take back the plane, that they probably wouldn't make it, but they had to try. He asked her to pray with him. "Our Father, who art in heaven," Lisa later said. His voice never shook. He was clear, steady, focused. At 10:03 a.m., passengers made their move. Trays were turned into shields. Boiling water from the galley was thrown. Someone grabbed a fire extinguisher. A food cart was used as a battering ram. And Todd's final words, heard by Lisa on the other end of the line, became legendary. "Let's roll." What happened next is known only in fragments. The cockpit voice recorder captured screams, scuffles, shouting in Arabic and English. The hijackers rolled the plane left and right to knock people off their feet. They pulled the yoke hard, trying to maintain control, but they couldn't hold it. Flight 93 crashed at 563 miles per hour into a field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Everyone on board was killed instantly, but the capital, likely the hijackers' target, was saved. In Washington, lawmakers had been evacuated. Airspace had been shut down. But if not for the passengers of Flight 93, the death toll could have doubled. The blow to American democracy could have been irreversible. Later, investigators found the cockpit voice recorder, almost intact. They played it again and again, trying to reconstruct those final minutes. What emerged was not a story of helplessness, but of defiance, of ordinary people becoming extraordinary in the face of death. Todd's wife, Lisa, was left with 2 young sons and a newborn on the way. But she has said that knowing what her husband did gave her peace. He didn't die a victim. He died a warrior. At the crash site, there's now a memorial, a 93-foot tower, 40 wind chimes, one for each soul lost, and the words engraved in steel, "A common field one day, a field of honor forever." Scene 5, a president in the classroom. At exactly 9:05 a.m., President George W. Bush sat in front of a group of second graders at Emma E. Booker Elementary School in Sarasota, Florida. He was smiling, holding a children's book, surrounded by reporters. The lesson was supposed to be routine, a brief photo op meant to promote education policy. But that smile would vanish within seconds. As the children began reading The Pet Goat, White House Chief of Staff Andrew Card leaned down and whispered 7 words into the president's ear. A second plane hit the second tower. America is under attack. The president didn't move, didn't speak. His eyes blinked slowly. He kept holding the book. Cameras rolled. The children continued reading, unaware that the most powerful man in the world had just learned his country was at war. For 7 long, silent minutes, he remained seated. Critics would later call those minutes a sign of weakness. Supporters called it composure under pressure. But in that moment, inside Bush's mind, 1,000 gears were turning. What was happening? How widespread was it? Was he safe? Was this just the beginning? Behind the scenes, the White House scrambled. The Secret Service ordered an immediate lockdown of Air Force One. Vice President Dick Cheney was rushed to the Presidential Emergency Operations Center beneath the White House. There, surrounded by military aides, he watched the second tower collapse. Condoleezza Rice, National Security Advisor, tried to coordinate intel from the CIA, FBI, and NSA, none of which had a clear picture. There were rumors of more planes, more targets. The Capitol, the White House, Air Force One itself. Chaos reigned. By 9:30 a.m., President Bush was hustled into a secure room at the school and connected via video conference to Washington. "This is a declaration of war," someone said. Another voice, "Sir, we need rules of engagement." At 9:57 a.m., he boarded Air Force One, not headed to D.C., but to Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana. The capital was considered unsafe. The very idea that the U.S. president couldn't return to Washington was unprecedented, a sign of just how uncertain everything had become. Inside the plane, Bush watched footage of the towers falling again and again. Like millions of Americans, he was glued to the screen, but unlike them, he now bore the weight of every response, every consequence. Aboard Air Force One, communications were patchy. Some phones didn't work. For a brief time, even the president had trouble reaching his own command center. The symbol of American power was now adrift above the clouds. Meanwhile, Vice President Cheney had authorized the U.S. military to shoot down any hijacked plane. It was a chilling order, but considered necessary. That command nearly led to the downing of United Airlines Flight 93, until it crashed before fighter jets could intercept. Bush finally addressed the nation that evening from the White House after hours of being airborne. "Today our nation saw evil," he began. He promised justice, vengeance, unity. But privately, behind those words, the administration was scrambling to make sense of the scope. Who was behind this? How had they missed it? And what would come next? The CIA had a name, Osama bin Laden, and one country stood out as a harbor for terror, Afghanistan. Within hours, plans began forming. This was no longer just about recovery. This was about war. Scene 6, Retaliation. The war on terror begins. The smoke hadn't even cleared from ground zero when the gears of war began to turn. Inside the White House Situation Room, maps of the Middle East were spread across tables. Generals circled locations. intelligence briefings flooded in. And one name echoed louder than all others: Osama bin Laden. He wasn't just a suspect, he was the architect. The CIA had been tracking bin Laden for years. They knew his name, his face, his reach. He had orchestrated attacks on U.S. embassies in Africa. He'd been behind the USS Cole bombing in 2000. But now there was no doubt. 9/11 had been his masterpiece of terror, and he was hiding in Afghanistan. More specifically, under the protection of the Taliban, an Islamic fundamentalist regime that ruled most of the country with an iron grip. They denied harboring bin Laden. They called for evidence. But the U.S. wasn't interested in negotiations. On September 20th, President Bush addressed a joint session of Congress. He said, "Every nation in every region now has a decision to make. Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists." The world held its breath. Within days, NATO invoked Article 5 of its charter for the first time in history. An attack on one member would be considered an attack on all. Even countries with icy relations to the U.S., like Russia and China, offered condolences and intelligence support. The war on terror had begun. On October 7, 2001, less than a month after the attacks, the United States launched Operation Enduring Freedom. Cruise missiles and airstrikes rained down on Taliban strongholds. Within weeks, U.S. Special Forces were on the ground, coordinating with the Northern Alliance, an anti-Taliban resistance group. The world watched live. Taliban forces crumbled quickly. By December, Kabul had fallen. Taliban leaders scattered into mountains and caves. Bin Laden himself vanished. Some said into Tora Bora, a mountainous region near the Pakistan border. But he was always one step ahead. Inside Afghanistan, American troops didn't find a centralized army. They found tribal warfare, shifting loyalties, and ghost networks of terror. For every Taliban fighter killed, another took his place. And for every strike against Al-Qaeda, new cells appeared across the globe. But back home, for a moment, the U.S. felt united. American flags flew from every porch. Enlistment in the military surged. Support for the war effort was overwhelming. News anchors wore flag pins. Late-night hosts went quiet. Even sports events opened with moments of silence. The attack had cracked something deep, but it had also fused Americans together in a way not seen since World War II. Still, a darker current flowed underneath. Civil liberties came under strain. The Patriot Act passed, giving government agencies sweeping surveillance powers. Guantanamo Bay began receiving its first detainees. The definition of enemy combatant blurred. The lines between defense and aggression, between justice and vengeance, began to smudge. In Afghanistan, the initial euphoria of quick victories faded into a grinding war of attrition. Taliban forces regrouped. Corruption plagued the new Afghan government, and Osama bin Laden remained free. Years passed, billions were spent, thousands of lives were lost. But 9/11s remain the justification, the moral compass, the reason behind every drone strike, every covert mission, every soldier deployed. It had changed everything, and America would never be the same again. Scene 7. The Road to Baghdad, How 9/11 Led to Iraq. In the smoky aftermath of 9/11, America was angry, and anger demands a target. Osama bin Laden was enemy number one, yes, but he was elusive. Hidden in the mountains, shielded by tribal loyalties, slipping through the cracks. To some in Washington, Afghanistan felt like swatting at shadows. But Iraq was tangible. It had a leader, a face, a flag, a military. It had a villain, Saddam Hussein. And for some in the Bush administration, Saddam had always been unfinished business. He had survived the Gulf War. He had defied UN sanctions. He was suspected of harboring ambitions of developing weapons of mass destruction, WMDs. Now, in the post-9/11 world, those suspicions turned deadly serious. President Bush's advisors, Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, Paul Wolfowitz, began to argue that Saddam wasn't just a problem for the future. He was a threat now. They suggested links between Iraq and al-Qaeda, no direct proof. But the argument didn't need certainty, only plausibility. CIA reports were cherry-picked. Allegations emerged that Iraq had tried to buy uranium from Africa, that mobile labs for chemical weapons had been spotted, that meetings between Iraqi officials and terrorist operatives had occurred in Prague. Doubt was repackaged as danger, and the American public, still in shock from September 11th, was primed to believe it. In January 2002, Bush delivered his State of the Union address. He called Iraq, Iran, and North Korea an axis of evil. He warned that Saddam was developing weapons to blackmail the civilized world. The drums of war began to beat again. Not everyone agreed. Allies like France and Germany expressed skepticism. UN weapons inspectors, led by Hans Blix, were sent back into Iraq. They found no smoking gun, no missiles, no WMDs. Still, the momentum grew. In February 2003, Secretary of State Colin Powell stood before the United Nations Security Council. He showed satellite photos, graphs, alleged intercepts, making the case that Saddam was hiding chemical and biological weapons. He said, "Every statement I make today is backed up by sources, solid sources." History would later show those sources were deeply flawed. But in that moment, the die was cast. On March 20th, 2003, the U.S. launched Operation Iraqi Freedom. Missiles struck Baghdad before dawn. The shock and awe campaign began. Tanks rolled across the Kuwaiti border. Saddam's regime collapsed in just weeks. Statues fell. Crowds cheered. The president declared mission accomplished aboard an aircraft carrier in May. But as with Afghanistan, victory was an illusion. Insurgencies erupted. Sectarian violence exploded between Sunni and Shia factions. Al-Qaeda in Iraq emerged, more brutal and radical than before. The weapons of mass destruction, they were never found. The war became a quagmire. Support at home eroded. The world questioned America's motives. And all of it, every death, every deployment, every dollar, was still justified under the shadow of 9/11. That day had not only scarred the nation, it had reshaped its foreign policy, its sense of purpose, and its willingness to wage war in the name of security. What began with 4 hijacked planes had now led to the occupation of 2 countries, and the cost was only beginning to be understood. Scene 8, the surveillance state trading freedom for security. After the towers fell, America changed, not just in its foreign policy, but deep within its borders. It began with fear, not just fear of another attack, but fear of the unknown, fear of neighbors, of strangers on buses, of backpacks left unattended, fear of accents, of prayers whispered in unfamiliar languages. Fear, like wildfire, doesn't need facts, it just needs oxygen. And into that fear stepped power. The government moved fast. Just 45 days after the attacks, the USA Patriot Act was signed into law. Few had time to read its hundreds of pages. Even fewer dared to question it. It gave sweeping powers to intelligence agencies. The FBI could now wiretap phones without court orders. The NSA could collect metadata. Who you called, when, and where, from millions of Americans. Financial records, travel logs, internet browsing habits, all open game under the guise of national security. No longer did probable cause mean what it once had. Suddenly, every citizen was a potential suspect. Airports became battlegrounds for privacy. TSA agents patrolled terminals with latex gloves and scanning machines. Shoes came off. Bottles were tossed. Names were cross-checked against terror watch lists, some that included toddlers or the deceased. It wasn't just the government. Private companies began harvesting data, sharing it with authorities. Tech giants, phone carriers, banks, they all complied. Data became currency, and the line between public protection and private invasion blurred. Communities of color felt the pressure more than anyone. Muslim Americans in particular found themselves under a spotlight. Mosques were monitored, informants were planted, entire neighborhoods were watched. Detainments happened without explanation. Citizens were held at Guantanamo Bay without trial. Enhanced interrogation, what some called torture, was rebranded as necessity. Waterboarding, sleep deprivation, sensory manipulation. Acts once condemned were now debated in prime time. It was all part of the war on terror, and most Americans accepted it at first. They were told it was temporary, that it would keep them safe, that it was the price of freedom. But freedom, once bargained, is hard to recover. Whistleblowers emerged. In 2013, Edward Snowden leaked classified NSA documents showing just how far the surveillance state had gone. Phone records, emails, text messages. Global surveillance programs targeting not just terrorists, but allies, even sitting presidents of other nations. The public was shocked, or at least they pretended to be, because deep down, many had suspected it all along. September 11th had rewired the American psyche. A generation grew up believing that privacy was optional, that suspicion was patriotic, that safety justified everything. The country hadn't just rebuilt its skyline, it had rebuilt its values. But was it safer? Hard to say. What was clear, though, was that the war once waged abroad had now come home. It lived in our airports, our classrooms, our phones, our neighborhoods. It reshaped how Americans saw each other and themselves. Scene 9. The Truth Movement. Questioning the official story. The dust had barely settled in Manhattan when the questions began. Not from fringe radicals, but from engineers, architects, pilots, professors. People who watched the towers fall and said, "Wait a minute, something doesn't add up." The official story, as presented by the 9/11 Commission, was this. 19 hijackers, mostly Saudi nationals, working under Osama bin Laden, took control of 4 commercial airplanes using box cutters. 2 hit the Twin Towers. 1 hit the Pentagon. The 4th crashed in Pennsylvania after passengers fought back. The towers collapsed due to fire and structural failure. The Pentagon was hit by a Boeing 757. The government had no prior knowledge. It was, in every sense, a failure of imagination. But, for some, imagination wasn't the issue. It was logic. They asked, how could 2 skyscrapers built to withstand aircraft impacts collapse in near free fall? How could fire, for the first time in history, cause a steel-framed building, World Trade Center 7, which wasn't hit by a plane, to collapse perfectly into its own footprint? Why were NORAD intercept protocols not followed? Where was the debris from Flight 77 at the Pentagon site? Why did it take over 400 days to form an official investigation? longer than it took to investigate Pearl Harbor or JFK's assassination. These weren't just questions, they were accusations. The 9/11 truth movement was born. It wasn't monolithic. Some believed the government let the attacks happen. Others believed they actively planned them. They cited Project Northwoods, Operation Gladio, historical examples of false flag operations, to suggest that deception was not beyond the realm of possibility. Loose Change, a viral documentary, took YouTube by storm the mid-2000s. Millions watched as it re-edited news footage, interviewed whistleblowers, and pointed to anomalies in the official timeline. People began to look at September 11th not as a tragedy, but as a pretext for war, for oil, for control, for surveillance, for reshaping the Middle East, for advancing the military-industrial complex. Mainstream media dismissed it all as paranoia, but the movement grew. Polls showed that over a third of Americans believed the full truth about September 11th had not been told. Families of victims joined the call. Organizations like 9/11 Families for Truth demanded a new investigation. They weren't asking for conspiracies. They were asking for answers. Some found solace in skepticism. Others found community. But all of them shared one thing: a refusal to accept the official story at face value. And why should they? After all, the Iraq War was based on lies. The NSA did spy on citizens. Black sites and torture chambers did exist. So if they were lied to once, why not twice? This wasn't just about 9/11. It was about trust. Trust in institutions, in leaders, in reality itself. The post-9/11 world wasn't just built on rubble and war. It was built on doubt. And that doubt continues to echo in classrooms, on podcasts, in documentaries, and in quiet conversations between friends who remember that Tuesday morning and still wonder what they really saw. Scene 10. Echoes of 9/11. How the day still shapes. America. More than 2 decades have passed since the world watched in horror as hijacked planes struck the heart of New York and Washington. But the reverberations of that day haven't faded. Every year, ceremonies honor the nearly 3,000 lives lost. Memorials stand as silent witnesses to a nation's trauma. Yet beneath the surface, 9/11 remains alive, not just in memory, but in politics, culture, and identity. It shaped an entire generation's worldview. For some, it's a call to patriotism, a reminder of sacrifice, resilience, and unity. For others, it's a shadow of fear, a justification for wars overseas, a reason to accept surveillance and security trade-offs. And for many Muslim Americans, it's a lived reality of suspicion and discrimination. Politicians still invoke 9/11 to rally support. It's cited in debates over immigration, national security, and foreign policy. Media outlets replay footage, retell stories, and shape narratives. Movies, TV shows, documentaries. 9/11 is a backdrop, a plot device, a cultural touchstone. The war in terror has morphed, but not ended. Terrorism threats are still used to justify policies. Airport security remains tighter than ever. Social divisions often trace back to that day's aftermath. Young Americans grow up learning about September 11th as a foundational moment. But what do they truly understand? For some, it's history. For others, it's politics. For many, it's personal. The wounds are still healing, the questions remain, and the story of September 11th continues to unfold. Thank you for staying with me through this journey. If this video made you think, question, or see things from a new perspective, Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives like this. Drop your thoughts and questions in the comments. I'm eager to hear what you think. Until next time, stay curious and keep seeking the truth.